I think that it's important to draw some distinctions, especially when we're talking about a psychological condition. So we are talking about, for instance, people who have meaning in their lives, people who don't have meaning and they lack, which is our first section, as you're saying, and people who are searching for meaning. I think that we can safely say that these are three major categories.
Sure, but I think people who are searching for meaning, that's never mutually exclusive of either of the other categories, because I think that's the default for all of humanity, really.
Yes, I think so. And there are specific pros and cons with each, let's say, category. Because, for instance, you could say that or at least, no, I think generally speaking, finding no meaning is negative. It's mostly a negative.
How did you come to that conclusion?
But I want to say also that one of the reasons why it is negative is because, first of all, it's bad for the person. But second, it creates a gap that will be filled at some point. So at some point, people who do lack meaning will try and fill that gap. And the question is, what are they going to fill it with?
It doesn't even need to be conscious either, in that just by living your life, these things happen sort of behind the scenes, if you will. But I wanted to quickly run through some of the deficits before you go into the more detail-oriented stuff. And just to sort of hammer home the negatives of having an absence of meaning, I suppose it makes you feel depressed, makes you feel hopeless about the future, makes you lack motivation, so you can't achieve your goals, makes you feel isolated and lonely. It makes you pursue short-term, perhaps more hedonistic pleasures. I know that term conjures up debauchery and things like that, but that's not necessarily what it means. I mean, someone could just eat lots of fast food or something like that rather than eating more healthily. I'm not one to judge there, but it's thinking about the short term over the long term, basically. And also, it reduces your resilience to adversity. I think those are the main things that I've kind of come up with. I'm sure there's probably some other stuff as well, but those are the things that I wanted to bring to mind. And does that sound reasonable to you?
I think so. And I think that what you mentioned about debauchery and the speed at which people try to become hedonists, or the speed in which hedonism just emerges in a person who, generally speaking, lacks meaning, is a form of search for meaning. But the issue is that it may not be good for the long run. So, for instance, this is a kind of, you could say, way in which, there's a chance that you can get instant gratification. You can find meaning in a Royale with cheese, for instance, or a Big Mac or something, but that is not going to last. So that's one of the extra negative effects of not having meaning, is that this is not something that, if you remain alive, can be sustained. So there is a chance that meaning will be somehow found. And the question is it good or bad? Because ultimately, meaning is about value. That's why we're calling people who don't think their life has meaning nihilists. The question is that actual nihilists will either vacate the premises, or they will be unconsciously people who think that there is a kind of meaning. And the question is, how likely is it that someone who remains alive, whatever they say consciously, finds no meaning? What's the likelihood of that?
I think,
because a lot of the times what we say about our evaluations and what we actually feel is meaningful are different.
I think actually it's it's basically impossible to be a nihilist, because if you believe that you're a nihilist, then you believe in something, and so it becomes an impossible position. Because you are a sentient being in this world, you have to have beliefs by necessity, And it's very difficult to reach that point. And people may self-identify with nihilism. I think there's also a certain amount of comfort in giving up and despairing. There's a sort of comfort in the darkness of it, if you will. Yeah. I'm not sure how to articulate it.
I can think of people who are in love with their misery, let's say.
Yeah.
It's a way of creating a comfort zone that they feel comfortable in.
I'm reminded of the lyrics of Kurt Cobain by, the lead vocalist in Nirvana. One of those lyrics is, "I miss the comfort of being insane." And there's a certain, I suppose there's some poetry in misery. There's melancholy,
tragic value or something.
Yeah, I think as well that melancholy as well. I think there's quite a poetic emotion, if you will, and so I think having a complete understanding of your own emotions is good, and not necessarily thinking that feeling negative is the end of the world, because I would just my own personal opinion, I would much rather sort of run the sort of cycle of feeling both positive and negative than not feel anything at all. I think not feeling anything is far, far worse than feeling something, even if it is negative, because at least you feel alive.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's a positive to draw out of a negative all on its own. It may not feel that way at the time, but I think that this sort of emotional purgatory where nothing changes and you're sort of trapped in stasis, that's far more horrifying to me than the potential of feeling bad, because I've always had the philosophy of the bad times make the good times better, in that you've got a frame of reference. If every single thing you did was good, then all of a sudden all these good things become devalued, because that's the only experiences you have. You have to have a bit of good and bad.
I think this is definitely true after we become adults and after we lose our innocence, in a sense, because you can say that children are in a sort of golden age of meaning. Everything is meaningful to them.
Yeah.
And afterwards, when innocence is lost and we grow up into the world and we see things around us, we begin to question. And I think definitely then we do see things in a sort of duality.
There's a sort
good
of
and evil.
Yin and yang, that you can't have one without the other.
Yes.
I think that's you can't have happiness without sadness. You can't have darkness without light. That sort of dichotomy where the absence creates the existence, if you will, which is, it sounds like a misreading of.
You can say that. I mean, when we are conscious of things, we are a lot of the time conscious of distinctions. So when it's one thing to be on automatic pilot, like we are when we're kids and we find everything meaningful, but then in a sense we have to work for a meaning, not only epistemically in terms of how we think, but also in other ways, practically speaking. But when it comes to thinking, when a lot of the time we understand things only in contrasts. And that happens with a lot of concepts. I think with every concept.
Well, I think when we think of sort of a sliding scale of something, be it, politics or meaning, we identify the two extremes.
Yes.
To figure out what's in the middle. Yeah. Because what's in the middle is more of a grey area than the poles. And so that's how we conceptualize of it a lot of the time. And so the temptation is, because we're thinking about it in either, I've got lots of meaning or I've got none at all, quite often you're more likely to be in the middle somewhere rather than at one of these extremes. But just by the merit of dichotomizing them in that way, it makes us, it gives us a tendency to evaluate things more towards the extremes, more towards the poles than you might otherwise. It'd be interesting actually to look at some research. I've not seen any looking at this, but I suppose you'd have to find an objective measure of people's meaning, which would be difficult because it's a subjective thing. So I imagine that's probably why there hasn't been. But if there were an experiment designed, this is purely hypothetical, I would imagine that people would report more extremes towards the poles than they would actually be in reality. This is my kind of intuition.
I have a view that may be a bit, may sound a bit weird, but I think that if there was a test in laboratory conditions, in a way, okay, that's obviously in a broader sense, I think that most reports of what people felt would be mistaken. In a way, I think there is a test, and it's life itself, and you can see what people do as opposed to what they say. Mm-hmm. And I think the overwhelming majority of people do feel that life is meaningful. They wouldn't be here if they didn't. But the tragedy is that a lot of the time, the meaning we pursue doesn't have the place in the world that we would have it if we were the grand architect of the universe. So in a sense, having meaning on the one hand and pursuing it are different, because you could say that, for instance, I find value in artistic creation, even if you haven't created something or if you haven't achieved recognition as an artist. You could say, for instance, that you find music to give your life meaning, or one of the main pillars of value for your life, and you want to be a musician. So the search for having meaning, you can have meanings and search for meaning simultaneously. If in the latter case, you're trying to become the artist that you want to become. Mm-hmm. In a sense, you have something that makes you tick, but it makes you tick and you keep going forward and you struggle for it.
Or say you want to go to art school and become a painter, and then you channel that failed artist energy into politics, and then you become a maniac. Sorry. That's my innate disposition to deconstruct meaning and destroy it, because I'm a miscreant at heart. But no, I entirely agree with what you're saying. There's an
interesting philosophical tangent there, but we may address it towards the end, because I think it has to do with excessive skepticism.
That was doing it on purpose, by the way. I'm not being serious. But no, I agree with what you're saying there. And I've got an interesting, interesting in my opinion anyway, approach to making people think about this. Because I've spoke to people who've basically communicated, I don't find that much meaning in my life, or things like that. And this is sort of my cold, sharp shock to make them stop thinking about it. It's a little bit silly, because I'm basically applying economic principles to the concept of life and death.
Oh, let's hear it.
which sounds ridiculous, but basically it's based on the premise that which is infinite in its abundance does not have value, because if it's infinite, then there's always enough supply to meet demand, and therefore it doesn't have much value, because value is the point between supply and demand. And if you apply this to human life is obviously not infinite. There is a limited supply. There's certainly a demand for more. Most people do not want to die. That is a sort of revealed preference by the fact that, sure, some people do commit suicide, and that is obviously tragic, but the vast majority of people live for as long as they can, and so there's a sort of revealed preference for living. And so because there is this subjective preference for living, it's fair to say that life has value. And when you work through it logically, even though everything I said is entirely obvious, and you'd be like, Josh, why are you saying this? You're talking to us like we're idiots. We're not idiots. But I think it's important to highlight this sort of thing, because if someone's miserable and you just point it out, and it's such an obvious and logical way of approaching it, that it is a good way of giving someone a kick up the arse, basically, to say, hey, listen, you're lucky, people want to live longer, make the most of it. And I think if you supplement this with giving them a sense of how fortunate they are to be having the experience of being alive at all, then it's quite a powerful thing, because I like to think of things in the sense of, well, I'm incredibly fortunate to be born in, you know, the UK at this period of time where, you know, I don't really have that much suffering in my life. You know, I'm not going to die if I get a bad tooth. If I, you know, get food poisoning, it's not going to kill me. Things are a lot better than they were in that respect. I'm not necessarily going to unduly suffer, because I think one of the things I do fear is unnecessary suffering or just extended amounts of pain. I think that's a reasonable thing to fear. I think anyone who says that they don't fear that probably just trying to make themselves look tough.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.